I can't hear you, Dennis.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Focus on Liberia. This is the Liberia History Channel. My name is Dennis Jai, and we are broadcasting from Atlanta, Georgia. In tonight's edition of the Liberia History Channel, we're going to be looking at first-hand accounts about the Green Coast, the place we know today as Liberia. We want to get some first-hand account about this place that is all the way before 1822. That's what we're going to be examining today. And who else can do this better than it's Carl Famula? Carl is our FOL public policy analyst. She is also a historian, so she's an expert on the subject matter we're about to discuss today. Carl,
I'm
welcome.
not my expert. I'm a student, but yeah.
I'm not even hearing that one. What did you say?
I said I don't know about being an expert, but definitely a student and a lifelong learner and student of African world history.
Welcome, Carl. Welcome to the show. It's glad to be back.
Yeah, we took a little bit of a break, right? Because it's summertime, the kids got out of school. We had, vacations and graduations. Um, so yeah, it's good to be back. So today we are going to start off kind of talking about how do we get, information out of firsthand primary source accounts and interpret that information, based on the context of how when it was written and who wrote it and what was the mindset or the mentality of the author. That helps you kind of sift through to get a little bit more to the truth, the sense out of the nonsense, as you say. But I'll let you introduce it, Dennis.
Thank you, Carl. Again, if you are just joining us, this is Focus on Liberia, and this is the Liberia History Channel. We're going to be, as Carl said, making sense out of nonsense. So, oftentimes people ask, okay, how do we get all this history of Liberia? Some even would say there are no books or there's this, there's no that. But there are some first-hand account. There were people that went through the place today we call Liberia, and they saw something, some wrote something, something was written about what they did, what they saw. And so we're going to be looking through those first-hand accounts so that we can sometime and the way, or I like how Carl said it, making sense out of nonsense. So somebody went to my town in Dudwicken, and then what they saw, they may not be 100% accurate, or they may describe the people in their own way. But from the way they describe them, we can tell what they were wearing, right? They may not know how to call the buba or the country club, but the way they will describe it, we can say, oh, this is what they're talking about. So I like it. So sometimes they write nonsense about us, but we use that nonsense and say, okay, here is what we did. I describe that correctly, Carl?
You did. I got pick sense out of nonsense is African American vernacular that's used a lot, especially in the South. Meaning, basically don't throw information away, don't throw the entire message away. You get the sensible part, even if a crazy person, conveys information, you pick the sense out of the nonsense. And yeah, so my mentor, my I had many mentors, but my greatest, most influential historical mentor or history mentor is Mahmoud Al-Kati, who has now retired. He was a professor of history at McAllister College in Minnesota. And his whole thing was always, when you're digging through primary source documents, you pick sense out of nonsense. So as African people, we're looking at 18th, 17th, early 19th century, even late 19th century literature for that matter, into the 20th century. You have to start to, you have to kind of have a shield of understanding that the world at that time, the way they viewed us, the way they talked about us was not in the most flattering terms. So you must always sift through a lot of really degrading language to be able to decipher and put pieces of puzzles together. Because unfortunately, much of the written record was done by people who did not have very high regard for us as a people. And history is what it is. These are things that happened. For me, I find the the uplifting story and the story of our resilience, even through the lens and the documentation and the records that were kept by people who held us in great contempt.
Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Carl. We're gonna talk more about that. Before we start, we want to say our friend and fellow co-host on FOL Marketplace, Mr. Larry Kennedy, is bereaved. He lost his father-in-law, that's the retired Major Jerry Wright. He was major in the Armed Forces of Liberia. Larry's father-in-law passed away in New York, so Larry is there. He was not able to be on the show today. FOL Marketplace, we say our condolences to the family and rest in peace, Major Wright. And we say thank you also for your service. I was also made aware of another death. This one is happened in this person appeared on the show before. When we were doing the Liberian community, we have a community in Canada, the Federation of Liberian Association in Canada. Their board chair, Dr. John McCarthy, he passed away. He, along with his mother-in-law, Ellen. Let me see. That's Ellen Weir. They say they were in. John is from Canada. Went to the U.S. visited the mother-in-law. They were driving in a car. There was a tragic motor accident, and both of them died. Again, our hearts go out to the families. John was my guest on Focus on Liberia some 2 years ago. And so again, our condolences to the bereaved. Carl, getting back to our topic, when we say we want to look at the first-hand account and to see why is this important?
Well, because written records, first-hand accounts, eyewitness accounts that are documented in, at the time that they're occurring, those narratives do not change. They're etched in stone, right? So it's almost like a photograph. Written records are photographed with great detail. So someone paints a picture of events that they see, and as it's passed down, it's passed down unchanged because you can go back and read the original words as opposed to untrained oral history, which as you tell the story, I mean, you can play this game, I think as kids, most people do in school, where one person is told something and they whisper to the next person. By the time it gets to the end, the whole thing has been distorted. Well, written records are not subject to that kind of distortion. However, it doesn't mean that they're 100% correct, right? Because a lot of times the documents or the perspectives, I should say, the narratives in the documents are skewed by prejudice, by ignorance, by misunderstanding. And so when you're sorting through documents, primary source records, it is very important always to understand the historic context and also understand the background and perspective of the author. So we have to know who is this that's writing this story, what was their mindset, what was their mentality, what was their level of familiarity with the subject that they're writing about or what they're observing. And also being able to decipher language and things like that. So a lot of things that get skewed in primary source records are the reference to people in a sense of what tribe or ethnicity they belong to through their observation. Many times in primary source records, you see people referring to Fulani people as Madingo simply because they wear Mohammedan or Islamic attire and are Muslim. I mean, a lot of these things get confused. You see people referring to any coastal population as Kru because, again, of ignorance, not really having concern of if this person actually is speaking, Grebo, or if this person is actually speaking some other coastal language. Everybody just becomes Kru because the person who's writing, may not really care to know that there's a distinction between the ethnic groups. And so you can take other things into account, such as, the description of the location of the people. You can take other things into account, like a description of the attire or some of the words that people speak, and you can say, oh, this is what we call Basa today. These people were not Kru at all. So that's kind of how you sort through that kind of information, using today's uh, today's knowledge and understanding as a reference point, what you know about your culture today, looking back at those things and being able to sort through.
Very good, especially at a time when and these records now they're very important because we didn't have actual written or nobody was writing about us at that time.
Right.
It's only from these records we are able to piece together. And what you are saying, we have to kind of glean some information from there based on what we know today. Because these people will make some vague references or call some things like you said, everybody from the sea coast there, southeast area, they will say crew. But based on what they will say today, you can tell if that person, maybe if they say we saw this crew person with tabadu, then you know, oh, okay, that Gribble person we're talking about.
Right, and there's really no such ethnic group as Kru, right? Kru isn't a real thing. It's not a real language. So
Exactly.
even calling people Kru is because of people observing them and referring to them as Kru. So the
Exactly.
Klau language is not actually Kru. They don't call themselves Kru in their own language.
No.
Same thing with Basa. That's not really, what it is. Even Grable, a lot of these words are distorted from observers who then, missionaries and others who then, imposed it upon us, and we just adopted it. So that's just what it is. I mean, even there's many languages. I mean, Pella people don't call themselves Pella. Manu is a Pella word for the Ma people. Nu is people. So that, we say Mamia, they say Manu. We just say, okay, we're Mano people. It doesn't make any sense. There's no such thing as a Mano person. But that's what we have adopted as a country. Some of those things I believe should be revisited. But a lot of our languages are not even the correct names that we would have called themselves. Our ancestors would not recognize what we call Gribble people. They say, what they call Gribble?
I know. Crown, crown.
Yeah, they wouldn't. Exactly.
And anytime you talk about maybe revisiting this thing, they say, well, that's not going to put food on the table. Why do we name this? Why? And so most of the time, those kind of conversation, they just get swept and we brush them aside and keep moving on because, as we all say, that what we'll eat. So because you're not going to eat that, we don't see the importance of revisiting. But let's get started. Today we're talking about
everything is belly driven, right? It's all about what we're going to eat. That's unfortunate.
So our topic we see the first-hand accounts of the Green Coast, what we know today as Liberia. So long before 1822, we were able to, as Carl said, to make sense out of nonsense and be able to have what we say Liberian history.
Right.
So, this is a sketch of the Windward Coast of Africa.
Yes. So as you can see, this entire place was called the Windward Coast. Sometimes when they talk about the Windward Coast, they're really talking about, roughly, Senegal to about the Ivory Coast area for the most part. Depending on what the context they're referring to the Windward Coast as and what time period. There are other times when the Windward Coast basically covers all of Liberia and half of Sierra Leone. So from about Bonse Island to what is now Cape Palmas. So it just depends on the time period what the Windward Coast boundaries were. Just like the Grain Coast / Pepper Coast / Rice Coast / Windward Coast. These are different names for our region over time.
Thank you.
Yes.
And comments are coming already. Stella Genesis is watching. Carla, I said Stella Genesis. Stella Jeffrey is watching. Moma Harry, how did the Quad tribe evolve? Okay, we'll talk about that. Carla Genesis, my teacher is teaching. Experience Liberia. I want to say hello and thanks for being amazing content to the people. He said, look like I took a break from social media at the right time. Glad I came back at the right time. Yeah, so you didn't miss the History Channel.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tanneh-Chewlae said, good job. Evie said, welcome back. And always a pleasure, Miss Carl. All right. So thank you, our viewers. Keep coming. We're going to put the phone lines later on. We want you to please participate. So we're making sense out of nonsense now. Dr. Franklin's essay on luxury, idleness, and industry in his letter to B. Vaughan is written in 1784. Wow, Carl, talk about this.
So, Dr. Franklin wrote a letter, some observations about what he saw in April of 1781, about what, basically outbound vessels coming from Sierra Leone and other curiosities. The next page, it has an excerpt from that letter, but it talks a lot about, the intention of the slavers and how people would be tricked and sold into slavery. He's talking about, we had another show where we talked about the King Peters of Meserado, and I talked about how there's multiple sources prior to 1822 discussing the King Peters of Meserado going back a couple of hundred years. The excerpt from the letter, it basically captures part of that picture. And so what I wanted us to do first is have a little exercise, and that's a page of the book, but the next slide is a short excerpt. But what we're gonna, if you could read that, what we're gonna do is, the exercise we're gonna do is read it, and then we're gonna discuss the context so that we understand how, when you see these primary source accounts, how you decipher them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, let's read.
Okay, so let's go ahead.
April 1781. I was informed that a young African was going to be conveyed on board a vessel bound for Sierra Leone. Curiosity induced me to inquire in what capacity he was to be sent there, as the grand question respecting the abolition of the slave trade had then become a merited object of universal investigation, particularly in this island. I soon discovered that the master of this poor Negro had no other intention in conveying him out of this country than to dispose of him afterwards with the greater facility for the wealth India market, in order to reinstate his expenses with profit. On closer inquiry, I found that this youth, whose name was Peter Panna, was really a son of the present Peter, king of Meserado, who had himself been educated at Liverpool by the slave traders. I discovered further that he had been kidnapped from his father, conveyed to a Mr. Hammer at Sierra Leone by an English slave vessel, Captain Fraser, and sold there to a Captain Kembe, who carried him to the West Indies, where he met with other slaves from his own country, who immediately recognized him to be their king's son. This fact was moreover proved by the mark he bore on his chest, which is inscribed on all the king's children to distinguish them from others. That's from that letter.
Yes, this for me is profound on so many levels. I want you to know this was written in 1781. 1781. And the first thing that so some of the language, I'm sorry, that where it says Wealth India, it's supposed to say West India. Sorry, it's supposed to say West India Market. One correction. I don't have a secretary, and I'm horrible at proofreading my own stuff. So I apologize for that. But so it's supposed to say West India. That was completely my mistake. But what I want us to know, Sierra Leone is what, they called it. Sometimes it would say Sierra Leone, sometimes it would say Sierra Leona. I mean, just depending on who the author is. That's another thing that you will notice as you're digging through primary source documents. You'll see Cape Mount, Cape du Monde, depending on who's writing. The spelling can be different. Prime example of that, Perseverance Island has now become Providence Island. It was always Perseverance Island. And then one day somebody said it, wrote it differently, and it just stuck. Meserado became Montserrado. Montserrado was, just a perversion of Meserado. So Meserado was the original name. So we still call the river Mesurado. We say Montserrado County because someone misspelled and mispronounced it. So getting back to this passage, um, he's talking again. This is yet another example of someone referring to the ruler or the Lord of Mesurado as Peter. And we talked about that long legacy of people having this Peter name. It's bestowed upon them at Cape Mesurado for many, many years, and it ended in the 1820s, of course, with the last King Peter of Mesurado.
And Carl, before you go ahead, this in that show when we're talking about the Peters, one of the things you say is because there has been an understanding that these names were changed by the ex-slaves or the settlers that came. So there was someone, you have Zolo Duma, you have all these people, and the settler changed their name because they couldn't pronounce the country name, so they started giving people King Peter, Long Peter, and all. Here is a document, 1781, as you are saying, that has the name Peter. This is over 100 years before the arrival of the.
I mean, even the show we talked about, the legacy of the King Peters, we're going back to the 1600s, right? So even 140 years before this, there was a King Peter, Lord of Mesurado. So these are generational Peters. And, we talked about a couple of different theories of Captain Petre, who was a Dutch a ship captain who settled there for some time, may have had offspring who went on to become, this kind of dynasty at Cape Mesurado. This is a common thing. When we study Liberian history, it's not much different from Sierra Leone history before settlement of repatriated Africans, right? So the two countries are really a similar region. Liberia, Guinea, Sierra Leone, that whole Mono River were culturally similar. So you have a situation where in Sierra Leone, there's well-documented families who are descendants of Europeans and African royalty who continue to rule and adopted this European dynasty type naming situation where they're passing the same name down to their firstborn sons, and it continues for many generations. Here we have Peter Pana. So Petra is Peter, different ways it's spelled over the generations, is really a title more so than even a name. So Petra of Montserrado just basically means this: I am in charge of this place. Whether they adopted it because of Captain Petra or they were actual biological descendants of Captain Petra is something that needs investigation. I mean, with all of the wonderful DNA technology that's available today, it would be a great anthropological and historical project to try to see if we could find some descendants and see if people have Dutch ancestry. But to get back to this, Peter Pana was very dark skinned. There were pictures drawn of him. He was sketched in Europe, painted, I should say, and he was a very, very dark skinned Liberian, pre-Liberian, and dark like myself. However, it doesn't take very many generations to erase mulatto ancestry, and then it just becomes recessive. Once in a while, you just see somebody pop up with blue eyes or something abnormal in the African context. So it is because, if you have a person who has one white parent, one African parent, that child marries an African woman, the product of that marriage is not going to look much different from all the other people around them. And so it doesn't take very many generations. I always say this, to erase a person of European and African heritage, to make that person resemble a full-blooded African. It doesn't take much time, many generations, usually just one. And so by the third generation, you can't really tell. Yeah. You can't tell the difference. So that part is important. And the other thing I think that for me that jumps out, and then I'll let you come in as well, Dennis, or anyone else, is that he's here describing the scarification, right, from the tribal marks from Poro, right? And he's talking about these marks distinguished on his breast. We know that comes from, again, that our very traditional culture, and we see a lot of old older men in our society that still have those markings, and those markings mean something. I wish someone had sketched Peter Pan's chest so that people who are alive today can read those marks and say, oh, yes, this is what this means. But of course, no one bothered to do that. So we don't know exactly how those marks that were described on his breast or chest, what those marks looked like. But we can imagine, because we see, some of our elders in the villages with the marks on their chests and their backs.
Yeah.
And it would tell you, so the devil swallowed me and spit me out, and that's why I have these marks, right? But the people who know, they know the meaning. So the sketch would have been important to present to the people who know, and they would be able to understand their connection to Peter Pana as well, cultural connection. So the idea, the third and most significant thing for me out of this passage, this man was taken to the West Indies, to what is considered the Caribbean today, the Caribbean. He's not specific about which island. So Dr. Franklin doesn't say they took him to Barbados. Dr. Franklin doesn't say they took him to Jamaica or Cuba. Dr. Franklin just says the West Indies. The fact that Peter Pan was recognized by people in the West Indies should tell us something. It sent chills up my spine. What this means is, think of the number of human beings that would have had to have been sold within his lifetime, that they could still recognize him when they saw him. And this was a very young man, probably around 18 to 20 years old, according to the people at the time who wrote about him. So people who had just recently been sold into slavery were able to see him and recognize him and throw themselves at his feet and say, my God, this is our king, this is our leader, and our prince, I should say, because his father was this very powerful, westernized. He's described, King Peter of 1781 is described as a westernized Negro by many British travelers, because he was educated at Liverpool, which means not only was he royalty, but he was exposed to this foreign culture, foreign doctrine. Educated usually means literate. So he most likely could read and write English, and most likely could speak English. You don't go to Liverpool and not learn how to speak some form of English. So in 1781, you have the ruler, the king, the head man, the Lord of Meserado. He's Anglophone. He is probably literate and extremely powerful.
Wow. So Carl, let me take you back to the previous page now where we see this letter, because the excerpt we just read came from here.
Yes.
For our reading, for the our audience, where did you get this from? Or anybody looking, where can they find this kind of document?
So most of these are digitized. You can usually get copies of this at your local library. If you're a university student, very, very easy to access this. Dr. Franklin's essay, volume 3, let's see. I'm not sure if this is available on Google Books. It may be. If it's not, it should be available at most university libraries. A lot of these old publications were spread all over at different universities. And then most universities have sharing options where if you, let's say at University of Georgia, and it's located at University of Alabama, they can get you a copy of it. So that's the beauty of so I don't know how you would be able to access it outside of Liberia. I do have a digital copy of this. So if you're interested in getting a digital copy, I can send it to you.
Ladies and gentlemen,
and there's no, by the way, when I say this, there is absolutely no copyright infringement because this book is so old, it's considered in the public domain.
Thank you. So if you want a copy, contact Focus on Liberia, a digital copy, and then turn around and help someone also.
Yes.
What you say about this picture?
So now we're getting into William Innes. I'm jumping all over the place here because the whole point of this exercise was really to pick sense out of nonsense. I'm sorry, this isn't supposed to be William Innes. Anyway, he cites some things about the Windward Coast, and that's what this really was. Observations on the Windward Coast, 1805 to 1806. Innes basically uses firsthand accounts by a man named Joseph Corey, who kept a very meticulous journal as he traveled on the Windward Coast, got to places like Cape Mount, Cape Mesurado, and documented meticulous detail about what he saw. And you have to remember, at this point in history, the transatlantic slave trade had not yet been abolished. So though what William Innes is writing about what Joseph Corey wrote in 1805 and 1806, the context of this is in 1833. It's 1805, 1806. So you can go to the next page and we'll read an excerpt from what William Innes wrote, and then we can discuss that as well.
And here is what William Innes wrote. Not many years ago, there were several of these slave stations within a few miles of Cape Mesurado, at which this trade was actively prosecuted. But since the establishment of the colony, they have been completely broken up. Every occasion for this purpose is made by the colonial government, and in 1826, they could say that the line of coast from Sierra Leone to Cape Mount is now under British protection, and from Cape Mount to Trade Town, the Liberian coast, a distance of 120 miles, the slave trade cannot be prosecuted with the least hope of success.
Right.
Many of the tribes are really disposed to abandon it, and all perceive the hazard with which in future it must be attended. But the most effectual method of putting an end to the traffic is by bringing it into discredit among the natives themselves, and this can be effected only by means of a colony. For centuries, these wretched beings have been accustomed to look upon this trade as the only means of securing a supply of foreign articles. Wars have been fomented and villages depopulated to furnish its victims, and they have found it far easier to make their purchases from the strangers in a way that will at the same time gratify their malignant passion than.
Oh, I'm sorry. So we should have stopped at passions. I wanted to put ... So he's just rambling on and on. So this is some of the stuff I'm talking about, is the picking sense out of nonsense. There is a lot of truth in here. And the reason I know there's a lot of truth is because what is written here can be corroborated by multiple sources, including ship manifests. When the slave trade was still legal, people kept meticulous records of how many human beings there were, enslaved human beings that were picking up, how many pieces of ivory and everything. And they counted the human beings in the same way that they were counting other goods that they were procuring from these various ports. So that part of it is corroborated by so many primary source documents and records. One thing that occurred in a tradition of commerce is meticulous record keeping, because people like to track their money. So if you send someone to go pick up goods, they're going to meticulously document how much they picked up, who was lost at sea and who arrived at the destination, so that they can, make a profit and show that they didn't steal any of whatever the ship owner sent them for. So this is true. What makes people uncomfortable is the tone, the subtle, it's not even really subtle, the tone of of condemnation in this whole thing. And almost as if only the Africans are perpetuating a process which was making the Western world, including Mr. Innes, extremely wealthy. This is always omitted when describing these details. They almost want to absolve themselves, as far as Europeans and those of European descent, of the responsibility of what is occurring. The fact that they're the ultimate end user and benefactor of this travesty, of human history. this horrible multi-century Holocaust. And they are now making it seem as though it was somehow initiated or instigated by the victims themselves.
Right.
So that is the part that is off-putting for a lot of people. Now, that does not mean that the information is false. That does not mean that African people did not actively participate in this industry for profit. It would have been impossible for them to enslave people if no one cooperated.
Right.
We have a saying in Liberia that persists to this day: if your house don't sell you, the street won't buy you. And this is a fact. While there were raids, not everybody's house sold them, but if you think of the greater house in general as being other populations and other ethnic groups of African people, other warring people, then if that entire thing is your house, then of course that is correct. If your house or your African house didn't sell you, the street wouldn't buy you. And sometimes literally your own home would sell you. So there's many accounts, even in oral tradition, of people being sold because someone's mother was accused of witchcraft. They didn't pass some kind of sassi-wood ritual, and so that person would be put to, or they died doing the sassi-wood, so all their children would be sold into slavery. Oh, your mom was a witch, you can't stay in the village, and they pack them all up and sell them. So sometimes that did happen as well. So that's important. Is there anything in here that you read that stands out to you, Dennis, or
Yeah,
any of the listeners?
yeah, the listeners, one of them, I'll say, uh, really he call our people wretched beings. Wow. And you were talking about the language
Hmm.
that,
I don't really know why that would be surprising. We were not, even to this day, the legacy of this is not really that long ago. And so the descendants of these people still, I mean, they still don't see us as fully human or worthy of existing on the same level. This is the birth of the false pseudoscience of white racial supremacy. So they're walking around thinking that we're wretched, the wretched of the earth, that this is what we deserve. And of course, in a state of centuries of warfare and degeneration, dehumanization, breaking down the society's culture for many centuries, you do have a sense of, if you're born in a society where there have been rolling wars for multiple generations, when have you had the time to settle and evolve your culture? Much had been lost at this period of time. We like to think that we were living in Liberia at an advanced state, and people came and settled and stepped on us. But the records show that we had been rearranged, devastated, conquered, sold, traded, depopulated, displaced, migrated, all of these things for centuries because of this horrible Holocaust that was imposed upon West Africa. And so people think that this is something that affected Ghana and Senegal. It affected West or Congo. It affected all of us. If Peter Pana could go to the West Indies and people recognize Peter Pana in the West Indies, think of the depth of disruption that occurred in the vicinity around Cape Mesurado, that the King Peter's son could go to the West Indies in a slave ship and be recognized by enslaved people who arrived before he did. That was profound to me, because we always want to think about slavery as something that occurred somewhere else.
And what Abel was making reference to is about these wretched beings. He said, for centuries, these wretched beings have been accustomed to look upon this trade, meaning the slave trade, as the only means of securing a supply of Western articles. Say, hey, they want what we have, so they are selling human beings. So they think that's the only means of income.
Right.
blaming, and this question about which till this day continue to be something that question or conversation, discussion, argument, or whatever you may call it, between
Right.
African Americans and the new and Africans here, or the, I could say, just come people that are here currently. Oh, you sold us. Oh, you had this, and we sold. That has been there, right? So for this guy to say, oh, they sold the people because they wanted Western goods, that argument continues to this day as to people blaming one another. Who so if you didn't sell us, the people were not going to buy. Oh, you sold us, and now so that is what is still being argued. How do we kind of find a way to put this argument or to meet somewhere and discuss this openly so that African Americans and those born in Africa who are already here, or the Africans that are here, can discuss this openly and with open minds? How do we do that?
I think that so history isn't so simplistic, right? It's not just a simplistic narrative. It is true that there's always been horrible human beings envious of each other who do look at our recent history during our lifetimes. Look what happened during our uncivil war.
Yeah,
People literally lied on people to get them killed
yeah,
because they had some grudge or vendetta or some deep rooted envy or some whatever frivolous, stupid reason people had to devastate the lives of other people. They took advantage of it and they did it. Much of the war that we had, the recent war, um, was an incredible reflection of the rolling wars that existed centuries before Liberia existed. It didn't come out of thin air. This was a manifestation of a cultural legacy that goes back centuries, old ethnic rivalries and upheavals that we never dealt with, that we never resolved, that are just at the surface. You scratch the surface, you unleash the beast of war and hatred. It didn't come from thin air. It's rooted in history. And these archaic and painful memories are passed down from one generation to another. When you watch footage of the war, the recent uncivil war, if you watch footage and you see how people dressed up wearing, mops on their heads as wigs, the war paint on their faces, the conduct, the brutality, and you read firsthand accounts of wars that occurred over the slave trade where they were looting for human beings, it is identical and exactly the same. And it is because culture, like your blood, is passed down from parent to child. And we need to address these things. So, yes, much of this is true. You don't need to look far to know that, like I said earlier, you look at today, you look at the conduct of our people today, and you use that to interpret the past. And you can see the parallels. You can start to understand, you can start to put yourself in their shoes. And you can see the betrayal, the selfishness, the greed, the hatred, the envy. You can see it in history. It wakes up. And the sad thing is, it is familiar. It is familiar because we still see these things occurring today. Even the incredible reverence that we have for our leaders, when we completely bow and humble ourselves to such a pathetic level that we look to them for simple things like food and direction and how to live our lives. It is from a legacy. It comes from somewhere. It comes from a lot of pain. It comes from a lot of trauma. We always like to think of slavery being something that happened to people who were taken out of Africa, that the trauma of the transatlantic slave trade only affected people who were taken forcibly out of Africa. The trauma of the transatlantic slave trade also devastated, derailed, dehumanized the
hmm,
population of people that remained in Africa. And many of the things that we consider culture today are a product of slavery, a product of a 3.5 century period of rolling wars and constant upheaval. So when you talk about how did Africa become underdeveloped, we had a civil war for how many years, and you see what that did to Liberia. Imagine rolling wars for 350 years. Because somebody asked me, they said, well, if it was West Africans, if it was, Liberians and Sierra Leoneans and Guineans who invented and not invented, but who domesticated rice and all of these, great, feeds, things like antibiotics were developed in our culture and taken to America. The first antibiotics, I'm sorry, not antibiotics, vaccines were developed by Africans in Africa, where we would take the disease and introduce it in a controlled manner in order to build up someone's immunity so that they could resist it. That is an African medical practice. And people will say, but how do we go from this advanced level where we were more advanced than Europe to being where Europe is sitting on top of our heads? The answer is the devastation of not only the transatlantic slave trade, but it began with the Sahara, the Arab slave trade, but the infusion of an imposition of conquerors upon our people for centuries. So that is why we ended up the way we did. And it wasn't because, African Americans came to Liberia with ACS. It is the same reason there are such a thing as African Americans in the first place. It's the same reason our people were devastated. Because you cannot rip 100 million people out of a continent over a 350-year period forcibly. And those are the survivors, not to mention the countless ones who died as a result. And expect a continent to evolve and the people to evolve in their natural, gifted way that they should.
And Cole, it's important that you say, let's look at, and I've had this conversation with Dr. Brewer before, like, let's look at the war. Most recent, I was in the Liberian Civil War, as a victim, and, as a teenager, so I remember this very well. I even wrote about it. And every time, an issue comes out, I'm able to reflect and see, oh, wow, these have some parallels. Take, for instance, we're talking quite recently, we see your images and video footages of Liberians, especially the women, being taken, what looks like slavery, because they are in this place, they're being dehumanized, beaten, and treated so horribly.
Right.
And all Liberians, we condemn that, and we are in awe as to why this is happening. But also, we should bear in mind that right under our feet, people are taking kids from the interior, bringing them to Monrovia, and they are using them as slaves because they are sending them in the street to sell for them.
Yeah.
Giving them no food. Or last week, it was a week or so ago, I had Mr. Smith Numba, who have a feeding program. And most of the kids that are selling, that's their story. They get them from the interior, say, hey, let me take Johnny to Monrovia, to go to school and all that. When this boy comes to Monrovia, they are selling in the street.
Yeah.
You stay there all day, sell, make sure all the product finished before you go. If not, you're going to be beaten. You're not going to eat. So these kids are in the street selling, they can't even eat. And so Smith is trying to feed them. So it's that same thing. So why are we appalled when we see Arab people, for instance, treating our people when we are doing it ourselves? So it is not about blaming who did this or who did what, but these things really happen, and we can see some parallel even today. So it's important you mentioned that.
Exactly. And I noticed also a lot of people would say, oh, we learned it from, the African Americans who came. I mean, that's just absurd. It's absurd. It is well documented. I mean, we have language for this. There's every ethnic group in Liberia has a word for slave. You don't create a word for something that you don't know about that didn't exist.
Yeah.
things that are foreign to us, we call the English name for it.
Like
but we call it but all of our dialects, I mean, it's such a long-lived practice. This devastating upheaval occurred for such a long period of time that every language on the Grain Coast has a word for slave.
Yeah.
That should tell you something.
True. Let's go to Joseph Corey.
Yes.
1805
So,
to 1806,
yeah.
observation upon the windward coast of Africa.
Yeah. So Innes, who we just read the excerpt from, he cites Corey. Um, so Innes also went on to write his own, observations at the time, but he drew some of the things that he learned from Corey, 25 years later. But now we're going back to firsthand accounts Corey himself. This is one thing about this English explorer they call Joseph Corey. He was a very good artist. He actually sketched many of the things that he saw himself. He describes this picture as a Madingo king and his headman. So he is in the area around Cape Mesurata, between Cape Mount and Cape Mesurata, which would be Bomi today, and somewhere around the Bomi area. And he's describing these people as Madingo, and he says that this is a Madingo headman. I mean, Madingo king and his headman. This is the sketch that he made in 1805 or 1806. He was there for that period of time. And this is very interesting to me. I also noticed that these people are wearing sandals, which was very unusual in the rainforest. So these people wearing sandals, this is a clear Sahel savanna of Africa cultural thing. These are people that probably came from northern Guinea, that area, from the empires, remnants from the empires, because these kinds of sandals that you see on their feet in the sketch, I don't know how if everyone can see, would not have been common on the coast. If you notice, the others in the back are not wearing any sandals, which was more common at this period of time.
And the sketch there, they don't, especially the one facing, doesn't look like Madingo.
So he could have been Madingo. He could have also, so anybody that was Muslim, Joseph Curry typically would refer to, a lot of, not only Curry, a lot of people. If you were Muslim, if you wore this type of attire, Madingo again was a term that was just used to describe Muslim people. A lot of language can point out, when you really listen, there's a lot of times they're actually describing Fulani people. For example, there's a lot of people who use language to describe Madingos, and they say, oh, they have clear Eurasian ancestry. They are fair skinned. Their hair is more loosely curled. They're talking about Fulani people. And then they will even go on to say they're from the Guinea highlands of Futa Jalon. I'm like, yeah, Futa Jalon, this is a Fulani empire. But you have Madingo, you have Fulani, you have a lot of other ethnic groups that adopted Islam, either through being conquered by Fulani, who massively invaded the area around Cape Mount in the late early 1700s. So the Fulani had come in and conquered this whole area. So it was a lot of Fulani invaders that converted people as well. There were also Madingos who came. So the Muslim people came, and then the Muslim people from different ethnic groups were also warring faction against one another. Eventually, the Fulani who had dominated the transatlantic slave trade from their kingdom in Futa Jalan, and they had sent warriors all along the coast to participate, they were eventually conquered by a collaboration of people who included Madingos, Soso, and others who finally conquered Futa Jalan and sold many people into slavery, including the royalty. And there's another story we'll get into. Some of the Fulani kings who were sold, or the Fulani prince who was sold into slavery, and the Moroccan sheikh had to, write the United States government and say, "Hey, get this guy out of bondage. He's royalty." So there was a lot of conflict. So Islam by itself was not a unifying factor. So you had Muslims fighting Muslims. You had, what we call Kwa people fighting Kwa people. You had, people who should be united by Poro, selling other people into slavery in their society. So it was a massive, chaotic period over a few hundred years. So we're going to read the excerpt from Joseph Curry. Sorry, go ahead.
I have been thus, I have been thus minute in describing this excursive voyage, that others whose business may thereafter lead them to this river may profit by the difficulties we experience in this critical and dangerous passage. We were obliged to come to an anchorage in the river during the night under a very violent rain, and the next day arrived at Robert, the factory of Mr. Aspinwall. This gentleman, whom a previous acquaintance had induced me to visit, received us with great hospitality and kindness. From a residence of upwards of 32 years on the coast, he possesses much intelligence and valuable information relative to this part of Africa, and I am indebted to him not only on this but on former occasions for many interesting particulars. That was Joseph Curry.
Yes. So another, of course, white supremacist, because that's what was normal at that time. That was a normal school of thought. And he was, writing about the slave trade as if it were some legitimate business. So he's talking about, this is important. Robart, which is a place, is, and this is, he's writing this in the year 1805. Robart is where we call Robertsport today. And they called the place Robart because, and for me, it's just very interesting. But, they say Robertsport is named after Joseph Jenkins Roberts. But before it was named after Joseph Jenkins Roberts, they used to call it a place Robart. So it was a slave trading factory. Factory just means like a store or a place, a storage facility, or like a warehouse for human beings and other goods that are waiting to be sold. They describe this as a factory. And so Robart was one of these factories along the coast, which is where Robertsport is today.
A factory where a factory for human beings.
Yeah, so factory didn't necessarily mean like a place of production. It was, if you look up the word, especially in the context of 1805, it was really not describing production, but more of a warehouse or a place where you could go and buy goods, mass quantities of goods. So Robart was a factory in Cape Mount, run by a man named Aspinwall, an Englishman who lived there for many, many, many years. And so this is 1805, and they're describing this person who lived there for 32 years. And it shocked me when I found out that many of our people think that the first white people we saw was like Hootie Ashman. You have someone talking about Aspinwall living in Robertsport, for 32 years. And he's talking about this in 1805. I want that to sink in for a minute. So for people who think that, nobody settled in Liberia, what is Liberia, until 1822. You have a European, an Englishman living in Robertsport for 32 years, and he was not the only one. Any other observations on this that you want to discuss before we
go? So this is in 17 something. This guy is living there because 1805 was already 32 years old. That is something.
No, not 32 years old, but have been there for 32 years.
I've been there 32 years, to that point.
Mm-hmm. So, for me.
I wonder what was their backing, so that one guy has a factory where he's selling and buying people, and he's among people that he's enslaving, and that's okay.
Yeah, so this is the whole thing. It's all the people just came, jump off the ship with guns and beat people and carry them. we were not, even in our most devastated state, we fought. So it would have had to have been collusion.
Yeah.
It's always collusion. So, this man was living there. Most of the slave traders were stationed permanently. You had Pedro Blanco at Galinas, which is the mouth of the Mano River, which now divides Liberia and Sierra Leone. Pedro Blanco lived there. He, raped all the fine ladies, born plenty children in that Galinas area are descendants, biological descendants of Pedro Blanco, because not only was he a slave trader, he was a prolific rapist, horrible human being, prolific rapist. Anytime they brought women from the up the river, and any of them were attractive to him, he would rape them. And some of them he would not even sell; he would keep in his personal harem. So he was like Pedro Blanco, the Spaniard, was like the king of Galinas. He sat on top of the people and raped and pillaged and had many agents working for him, both African and European. So he had a lot of European working for him and stationed all along the coast, and also African agents. And then he had a whole network of kings and traders and people that he interacted with, many of whom came from faraway places like Bopu and all these other places. And they would bring human beings and he would reward them with all kinds of things that we don't even consider to be valuable today.
Yeah.
So this is actually stuff that happened. As painful as it is for us, these are things that happened, and it explains so much, because I do want to say this. When people say Africans sold their own people into slavery, this is a bit of a racist statement, and this is why. Nobody says that when England was stepping on the throats of Irish people, when Britain was stepping on Scotland and Ireland, nobody says Britain was killing, and oppressing its own people. Russia, Ukraine, the Russians and Ukrainians are more closely linguistically, historically, and culturally related than Bassa people are to Vai people or Madingo people. The language and the culture is more closely related. Nobody says that these Eastern Europeans are killing themselves, their own people. Nobody says that. There's some racism involved in erasing people's ethnic individuality and looking at history through the eyes of people who didn't see the differences in people, who saw differences between themselves. And Dr. Justine Carr always says, you don't read history backwards. I think Dr. Brewer always says that as well. Yeah. You don't read history backwards. The reason is, at that period of time, those Africans are not looking at all the other people just because their skin color is the same as being the same way Europeans don't see all the people with, well, now they're starting to, but historically in history, the context of history, the people of World War I, World War II, they were not looking at killing their own people. They were killing enemies. They were selling enemies into slavery. So part of the dehumanization of Africans in history is to make it look like we were all some kind of tribesmen jumping around without complex differences and linguistic, cultural, moral, religious differences. The same complex lens that we use to dissect European history, we don't apply it to Africans, and we must if we're going to understand the truth.
And Call, that's important because look at, for instance, today African leaders and the decisions they make during the war. Because I found out during the war when we saw Burkinabe's fighters among the rebels. And because of that, as a young man, I hated Burkinabes because in my mind, Burkina Faso was kind of coming to Liberia to fight. Like it was some collective decision that everyone in Burkina Faso sat down and said, let's go to Liberia to fight. We didn't see that those were the Frenchies in society. Those people that were already around doing some many jobs in Africa, those guys rejected, like, we have the people they call Zogos in Liberia today. So if there's war, who you think will be there to find something to eat or smoke?
Yeah.
if Charles Taylor took a decision to go into Sierra Leone and fight, now we're going to be perceive it as, oh, Liberia went into Sierra Leone to fight. We don't see that we have bad leaders that take bad decisions.
Yeah.
We have bad people in our midst. So it is not Africans selling African per se. It's just wicked people among us doing evil things.
Yep. Yep.
That takes us to our next slide here. The factories, and Dr. Edison Pajibo was helping me here with the definition. He said the word factory comes from the word factor, a reservoir of goods. For example, where shoes and sandals were made and sold.
So the reservoir of goods, reservoir is in like a warehouse, a place where you can collect large quantities of things. So when you see factory, and thank you, Dr. Pajibo, the word reservoir, it's a holding place. It's a place where things are. I mean, as language evolves now, it comes to mean manufacturing. But another definition of factory is basically a big warehouse or storage facility, a place where you can go and procure mass quantities of something.
So some of these holding places of trade in this river were the factories of trade in this river.
Yes. So we have Mr. Aspinwall, who had been living at Cape Mount since 1770. So he was probably elderly by the time, that Joseph Curry interacted with him. And he took Joseph Curry, kind of showed him around, and he knew so much. He could speak some of the native dialects and all this kind of stuff. He was very, very, 32 years, you live somewhere, you become, very culturally inclined. There's a term called go native that they use on a lot of these Europeans that were living on the coast of Liberia and Sierra Leone. They say that people went native. They lived there. They took wives, among the people. They had children and started speaking the language, eating the food. They were basically culturally assimilated. But Aspinwall,
Koto, even to that point, I was in Bamakama for just less than 6 months, and my pellet, man, was just fluent. Yeah. So
so you went native.
So anytime I talk to my pellet friends, especially from the Lofa area, when I tell them I'm from Paye, Zoklomo, and all that place, they say, "Oh yeah." So yeah,
that's nice. So you've got Aspinwall was at Roberts Fort, and you've got Boatswain, the one that we incorrectly, in my understanding, call Sao Boso. This is definitely no. The story of Sao Boso coming from the north is completely different. This guy, they call him a black chief and trader who was above Robart at Cape Mesurado. So this is more evidence that Boatswain and Sao Boso were not the same person. But this is the same Boatswain being written about in 1805 that was still at Cape, between Cape Mesurado and the Opulu corridor, trading in human beings in 1822. It's the same Boatswain. So they have him listed in a row with 3 other prominent European British agent traders. This same Boatswain in another passage is written about raising the British flag in Opuru. And so some of the boundary disputes between Liberia and England go back to this Boatswain who raised the British flag on behalf of the British, though he was an African. He was, according to Ashman, who wrote about him, he was Bullum from the coast. So this is definitely not the same person that they talk about who came from the north, Sao Boso, who came from the north and was trading in salt. This human being was trading in human chattel, and he was an agent working with the British. He erected the British flag before ACS ever arrived at Cape Mesurado. And this is some of the reason for the boundary disputes on that part of the St. Paul River was because of this man's conduct. And he went that far north because there was a huge population of Pele people in Boburu, and many of those people were raided and sold into slavery during Boatswain's reign. So Pele people became almost like the main target for the Vai, Gola, and other ethnic groups that were working with Boswin. They would go and raid and march these Pele people down from Bokuru down to the coast and put them on ships. So a great number of the Liberians who were sold into slavery were Pele people from the Bokuru region. And then you've got Mr. Lewis at Rokupa. You've got Mr. Gordon at Thomas's Island. So those were the 4 factories that Joseph Curry visited and interacted with those people. So he interacted with Boswin, he interacted with Mr. Aspinwall. He spent most of his time with Mr. Aspinwall at Robart, but he also met with Boswin and these other 2, Lewis and Gordon, during his 2 years on the Windward Coast.
Rokupa sound like a Pele name.
Yeah, probably. I don't know. I wish I had more of a linguistic background, but
that sounds.
So a lot of the towns and places were often named after people. So it's possible that Aspinwall called that place Robart because maybe somebody named Robart had been there before. But people say, "Oh no, it's called Robertsport because of Joseph Jenkins Roberts." Okay. Maybe we should look at that a little bit more because so the next slide, this is interesting. This is really going to be the last story. This stuff is pretty detailed, but this is another primary source account from a monster, a devil of a human being. Probably the most disturbing book I have ever read in my life. But when you talk about pick sense out of nonsense, this Captain Cano, or 20 years of an African slaver, I've studied this book to the detriment of my my stomach, really. There's parts of this you just want to vomit. The vile hatred that this slave trader uses, the hateful language that he uses to describe African people, is just extreme, and it's appalling. And it's done because he has to dehumanize the object of his exploitation in order to be able to live with himself. And so a lot of times when they engage in this horrible act, the way that they wake up in the morning and proceed, besides drinking mass quantities of rum, is to dehumanize the object of their exploitation. So in this account, this firsthand account of a slave trader called Captain Cano, Theodore Cano, you see the hatred and a lot of lies, right? A lot of lies. I mean, he really wants to make Africans look like, extreme caricature of savagery. And we're Africans, and we know we're not caricatures of savagery. We know we do not own violence, and we know we do not own wickedness. It is the property of all human beings. All human beings have done awful things, especially Europeans, to the entire world. So Captain Cano's book is not for the faint of heart. If someone's going to get caught, off guard.
Call your voice is your audio is just got bad. So let's take a short break.
Okay.
At Focus on Liberia, we discuss everything Liberia, from education to politics, arts and culture, entertainment, agriculture, history, religion, family, and technology. Focus on Liberia uncovers and showcases the best of Liberia and shows the world the truth about Liberia. We educate, elevate, and promote all things Liberia. We conduct interviews, panel discussions, debates, and more. Tune in to Focus on Liberia on Facebook and YouTube and be a part of the stories that make up the news.
This is Focus on Liberia, and I am Tanneh-Chewlae.
Welcome back to the Liberia History Channel, live on Focus on Liberia. Our presenter here is student of history, also Focus on Liberia public policy analyst, Mrs. Carl Fambule. Carl, let's go to another slide here.
Yes.
On the Vai people mark with some ceremony.
I want you to go back to the funeral of Prince Gray and Panama and Cape Mount.
You were talking about it.
Yes. So I was just saying that if people have, if people are taken off guard by somebody calling us wretched, this is not the book for you. Because this man embellishes and does all kinds of things. I did not extract any of the passages or the accounts that I knew were complete BS, right? So I picked some sense out of the nonsense in this book. And the next few pages are in line with reality of what would have been occurring at the time. And so there's some cultural and anthropological nuggets in here from firsthand observation of a person who lived at Cape Mount, a European who lived at Cape Mount before Cape Mount became part of Liberia. And he talks about the funeral of Prince Gray, who he considered to be his friend, at what is at the time was called Fanama in Grand Cape, what is now Grand Cape Mount County. So we'll go to the next slide. So you can go ahead and read and then we'll go from there.
The Vai people, or the Vai, mark with some ceremony the extreme of human existence, birth and death. Both events are honored with feasting, drinking, dancing, and firing, and the descendants of the dead sometimes impoverished and even run themselves to enter a venerable parent with pomp.
Okay, so we're talking about, early 19th century English here. So basically, they is the correct pronunciation of the people in the language we call Vai. And so back then, they actually wrote it correctly. The people don't, when I hear my in-laws speaking, when they say Vai, they don't, in their language, they say Vai. So I think it's funny that we spell it VAI today, because even today, they don't pronounce it Vai, they say Vai when they're speaking their language, when they're speaking the language. So that's interesting, because back then, that's how the language was written. I don't really know why it was changed to VAI. I don't know, somehow trying to be Kui, but whatever the case, it's still pronounced Vai in their own language. What I liked about this is, and I had to preference all of this by talking about the picking sense out of nonsense. The sense of this passage is very much in line with the cultural practices of our people. We do celebrate birth and we do celebrate death. While it's a process of mourning, we do celebrate it with feasting and drinking. The firing. These people, these Vai people were heavily armed. So the other misconception is that our people did not have weapons. Many of the things that human beings were traded for was more weapons and artillery, gunpowder. The Madingo, the Fulani, the Vai, the Bandi, these people, the Timini, the Mendi were reverse engineering. They were manufacturing weapons, muskets.
Yeah.
They were also getting them from Europeans who were smelting iron, who were making weapons, very, very well manufactured weapons at this period in history. And at some point, we really only needed gunpowder from these people because the weapons that we were making were even superior. So I find it very interesting that people think that Africans in 1822 were unarmed, running around, waiting for somebody to come beat them. If you can celebrate the death of a king by shooting, firing up in the air and, blowing up stuff, you're not some helpless, vulnerable group of people that's waiting to be, stepped on or pounced on by other people.
Yeah.
So that's an important, I just like the Vai script. I put it up there. At this point in history, the Vai script was written in the early 19th century. But did you have any questions on this before we move on, or does anyone that's watching have any questions on this?
Right. Let's move on. We'll come to the comment soon.
Okay.
Now, who's writing this?
This is Captain Cano writing all this stuff.
So Captain Cano said the breath was hardly out of the prince's body when his sons, who owned but little property and had no slaves for sale, hastened to my agent and pledged the town of Panama for means to defray his funeral. In the meantime, the corpse swathed in 20 large country sheets and wrapped in 20 pieces of variegated calico was laid out in the hut, where it was constantly washed and smoked by three of the favorite widows. So the first in the previous slide said when there is funeral, these guys then will spend until they have nothing left.
Yeah.
Till they get poor.
Basically.
If you go to my town and you hear the parable, where you're Finton, they say the person who will do all these good deeds to give out lavishly, that at night they can cry because they know they will give everything out. So when they go to bed, they say, "Oh God, what did I do?"
Yeah. So the calico they're talking about is basically our country cloth, and is variegated. It's woven country cloth. And you're talking about, and this our country cloth was so valuable to Europeans because it was so well made. It was so sturdy, so heavy. It served well as blankets to cover you from the cold. These are things that come from the northern regions of Liberia originally because it's colder up there in the mountains of Lofa and Nimba. Going into the deeper into the Guinea Forest region. This is where this culture of country cloth comes from. And it's one of the most desired textiles in the world. It was very valuable. So some of the things that they were trading was this calico, this country cloth. It was valuable in Europe. It was considered some of the best quality fabric at that time, and was highly sought after. And so I have this picture of these two Bay women in their beautiful country cloth. So assuming that Prince Gray's wife would have looked like this. Now I know that this gray name, it's not the color gray, and it's not an English word. Because you see this among the Bay people going further back than even this name Gray, King Gray, Prince Gray. So it must be a Vi name, and it was just spelled in this way because that's how it sounded to those who were writing it. But you've got a lot of modern present day Vi people who carried a Gray name. Akaris Gray, Seafua Meg Gray. I mean, there's a lot of people alive today who are Vi who carry this Gray name, and people assume that it's English or some anglicized name. And I see this name, written 100, 200 years ago.
Oh, wow.
So,
yeah. I got
so you're talking about Prince Gray over 100 years ago. So this is not some new name that somebody went and put on their head and said, "Oh, I'm going to call myself Gray so I can be queen." No, this is definitely a traditional name.
So from the records office, Mr. Mambu Gray, that's my in-law.
Okay.
Mount is V, not Vi, people.
Yeah, V.
Let's
So, and just to go back, go back one slide. I forgot to mention. So the VAE syllabus was created in the 1830s by Mamadou Doualou Boukele. And he created this because he was a very prolific writer of Arabic, and he was a great Arabic scholar. And he was mocked by a European who said to him, why do you write your language? Because he wrote the VAE language in Arabic, using Arabic letters. And they mocked him and said, but Mamadou, you're writing in your Arabic, you're writing your language in Arabic, why don't you have your own script? And this offended him because he was such a proud and dignified man. So he said, this is offensive. Our literacy is in Arabic, so we must be literate in VAE. So he created the script from scratch, which is pure genius.
Yeah.
And that's why we have the VAE syllabi. So sorry, I didn't want to skim over that part of our history. Let's go on to the next.
After 2 months devotion to mourning and seasoning, notice was sent 40 miles around the country, summoning the tribes to the final ceremony. On the appointed day, the corpse was brought from the hut, a perfect mass of bacon. Session moved towards the Palaver house. The prince's 20 wives, get out of here. 20 wives, almost entirely denuded, their heads shaved and their bodies smeared with dust, were seen following his remains. The other spouse appeared covered with self-inflicted bruises, burns, and gashes, all indications of sorrow and future uselessness. I see some of that, I don't know about the gashes, but their head will be bowed, they have to move.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, this is all over, right? The Mono River Union. Your mom died, you shave your head. Your husband died, you shave your head. This is a practice among my people, the Mon people, the Guinea Forest region. This is a practice on the coast. This is definitely in line with our cultural traditions. What this is telling me is that not only did we shave our heads, but we used to self-mutilate as a part of mourning, and probably just outgrew that part of it as we became more, westernized. Because to be yourself and cut yourself, as part of grieving, it makes sense to me, in a kind of ancestral way, that to let your body of the pain, you want to cut and release that pain through bleeding, the grief, you're releasing it. So the cultural context of it makes sense to me. And that's why I said I'm picking sense out of nonsense. I believe this statement because it resonates with me from a more, on a spiritual level. This is something that makes sense. Though we do not do this any longer, it's in line with the shaving of the head. It's in line with throwing yourself on the ground and crying, to release this pain of losing your loved one. It's all, for me, when this is sense out of the nonsense of this person's lecture. And so he is describing what our cultural practices would have been over 100 years ago. Things that we no longer do and maybe have not been passed down to us orally. But we can now see this written record, even from one of the greatest enemy of African people, was able to write something that is of value to us. Though much of what is in the book is disrespectful, we're able to pick, the gold out of the dirt.
Yeah.
So this is going to end my explanation of how you pick sense out of nonsense, how you can still learn from some of the most despicable characters in history. Before you do so, though, you must be well rooted and grounded in yourself, your own understanding, so that you are not seeing the world through the eyes of these people, but you are able to sift it through their perspective and see it with your own perspective. And this is something that's very important. It takes skill and it takes a greater understanding of human history and who you are to be able to do this, which is why if you are not really trained to study primary source documents, it's better to just pick up a book by Patrick Burroughs or anyone else who has been trained to do so and just read their perspective, because they have been trained to sift through this stuff and pick the sense out of nonsense, reconstruct it, publish it, and present it in a more digestible manner for the public. But if you're interested in doing research in history, you have to know the context in which things were written so that you can understand how to interpret it for yourself.
Thank you, Carl, for making sense out of the nonsense written by this Corey guy, man. All right. We're going to put our phone number is on the screen so that you can be part of this. But here is one guy who too is Dualu. He said, yes, Dualu, the genius continues. And there's Dualu trying to make himself look like Dualu Bokili. And so you are no Dualu Bokili.
No, do they teach us about Dualu in school in Liberia? Is that something we learn about?
Yes, a little bit that he wrote a script and yeah.
Okay.
So Dualu now is trying to claim that. Joseph Kokro said, wow, I just entered and incidentally my favorite subject and professor popped out. That's is Elder Joseph Kokro is talking about Professor Carl Famule. So that's it. Let me read a few comments here. We have our callers already on. Dr. Pajivo Gibbon, the English historian, defined history as the story of man in search of his daily bread. And as our scholar in residence called Yeyia puts it, it is the story of our people. I have gone through 2 consecutive sessions of FOL today, but I must hold my sleep at bay to hear Carl narrate this our story. By the way, Dr. Pajivo is all the way in Ghana. He's a professor there. That guy love book.
Thank you, sir, for staying up and listening. I appreciate your feedback. Thank you, Doc.
Philip Kemuse, very educative. How I love the show, but kind of late. You can still watch our episode, watch it on YouTube.
Right.
D Square Musa, I've been interested in Liberian history before 1822 and happy that I'm here. Thank you all for watching. It is always Leo Lekbele Nupulu Johnson. This attitude of people who claim to be historians blaming Africans in any way, shape, or form for the slave trade is shameful, unacceptable, and unfortunate. Evie had a question for call, so I will now let Evis come on and share his question. Evis, you are live. Thank you for joining the show.
Thank you, Mr. John, and thanks to Mrs. Call. Ms. Call. I don't know the right pronunciation. I guess sometimes you'll correct me on how to pronounce the name.
It's Call.
I want to know is it a miss, a mistress? Which
mistress? Mistress. Call family.
All right.
If you confuse, just say Professor Family. That's all.
Don't call me Professor.
She was.
Do not call me Professor.
She was nicknamed and bestowed the professor in residence.
I beg you, yeah.
Resident color called Family. Go ahead.
Yeah, just call me Call.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have some, curious questions that maybe she can expand on for some understanding. Quickly, I just want to ask about there's a people in the United States, in the Carolinas, they call them the Gola Geechee. And I read something on there a while ago, and I think they're supposed to be related to the Gola and the Geechee people from Liberia because it said that they were brought to the Carolinas for rice growing.
Mm-hmm.
These people specifically are really, their culture is really around rice. They have the red, what we call it, the jollof rice. In their culture, they call it the red rice. They cook that rice and they put pretty much the same thing that we put in there. There's some few famous African Americans who are from the Gola Geechee people.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I was having a conversation with a gentleman in the comment section there. We're kind of arguing a little bit about Islam and slavery, and he was trying to defend that Islam never advocated slavery. Matter of fact, people came, with the Islamic idea to abolish slavery from what is now Liberia, and I was arguing with him that no, you can argue that the Arab slave trade was even more, detrimental, even worse than the transatlantic. So we was kind of getting into that. Maybe you can expand on that a little more. And then also, just thank you again for this topic of dedicating yourself and doing the research and bringing this to us. We really appreciate it, and it's always great to have you on the show. And the information that you share is always welcome and appreciated. Thank you, Mr. John, for taking my talk.
Thank you. Corey, you want to respond before we have 3 minutes.
Let's take all the calls and then.
All right. All right. Let me go to the next caller ending in 4689. I think Hoxton Brooks. Is that the correct name?
It's actually Houston, spelled a little differently than the city, but it's pronounced Houston.
Oh, Houston.
I'm a long time. Yes, Houston Brooks. I'm calling from Honolulu, Hawaii.
Oh, wow.
I'm a long time, listener, follow your show. And I'm very grateful for Madam Fambule and you, Mr. John, for such an informative program. So this afternoon, or it's in the afternoon for me, here in Honolulu, Hawaii, we're behind in time for most of the United States. Yeah, so my question for Madam Fambule, I want to first of all thank her very much. I have a lot of respect for her and what she do. As far as the topic of today is concerned, my question for her because I am one of those people of the school of thought that used to go around saying, hey, like we say in Africa, the streets, if your house don't sell you, the streets will not buy you. So I was among those people believing that, hey, Africans, we sell our people into slavery. Now, after listening to her and, making a comparison with the people of Russia and Ukraine, and my question today is, I feel that she is somehow removing, when you consider all the dynamics that happened in the history of slavery with our people, she is completely removing any part to blame on our people ourselves. So my question is, if you look at the United States of America, the Native American, can she throw a little bit of light on how the white man was never able to successfully enslave the Native Americans, but the Native Americans themselves are not monolithic people. There were differences in their language, there were differences in their culture, but yet and still they were able to come together and fight off the white Americans to near extinction. They were not successful in enslaving the Native Americans, but they were successful in enslaving Africans. So I believe. So my question is: are we not also part and parcel to blame?
Thank you.
Great question. Is that the last caller? Or we have more.
No, we have two more. Let me Opa Ansu Dualu, aka Dualu Bokili. You're alive.
You're all right. I think it's a great name. Well, we hear about Dr. Barrow's books and all the books being written about Liberia. My issue is, there's a concern. I log into the show very late. I don't know what I already covered, but I just want to ask this question. It seems like previously, all the people told our story. Our story was written from the perspective of the Europeans. And do you think we are doing enough now to write our own stories so future generations can be making the same excuses that we're making? And to follow up on that, are we actually teaching that history, or are we reading that history as we should? Thank you so much tonight, Ms. Family.
Thank you, Opa. Let's take our last caller here from 614 Iroko. Your name and where you calling from?
Hey, Brother Giant, it's Brother Carr.
Hey, Dr. Jason Carr.
You should be here.
Once again, it's a master class of history that we're being treated to this evening. Thank you all for what you're doing. And if I can add a little bit to,
sure.
Carl, actually, she correctly and accurately talks about the rolling wars, which was very, very important for people to understand what they were. And also, I'm going to just add, and Sister and I have spoken about this before, the fact that the importation of firearms to the African continent, right? You can see the direct, to West Africa, you can see the direct correlation between the amount of firearms that were imported and how the rolling wars increased, and how this generated more enslaved Africans. That's an interesting study. Like I said, Sis Khan has spoken about that. How Europeans more firearms and how it increased warfare, and how this warfare generated more enslaved Africans. Because you must remember, in but a few instances, like the Portuguese, I think in Angola, most Europeans never went to capture people because and so forth, and they remain on the coast, on the coast for the most part. So that's all I want to say. Great program, Sis Carter, Brother Dennis, keep up the good work. Look forward to listening and hearing more.
No, joining, not listening.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you, Dr. Carr.
Yeah, thank you for that. Dr. Carr is one of the intellectual giants of my generation, and I look forward to the great things that he has to give to our country in the coming years. I will start answering the questions, starting with the Gullah Geechee people of the Seacoast Islands. The last episode of the Liberia History Channel goes into a little bit of depth about that. They're not all, of course, descendants of Gullah, Geechee, Gola, Kisi people, but you know, there's also people from Angola, from Congo, from all over, you know, what is now Nigeria. So African Americans, even the Georgia Seacoast Islanders, are a great mixture of many different ethnic groups from all over West Africa. But there is a dominant presence of Gullah or Gola and Kisi people. You've got the Ogeechee River here in Georgia. And they say, oh, we don't know what this word means. It's not Native American. It's old Kisi. It's the old Kisi River. It's the old Kisi River. And you know, those are the people who are being brought there in great numbers and high concentrations. So most of the people in the Georgia Seacoast Islands have some Gola or Kisi ancestry, but they also have, you know, Yoruba, Ebo, different other things mixed inside them, because everyone was brought together with a melting pot of African culture. I talk a little bit about that in the last the last episode of the show, because I had just come back from St. Simon's Island. So I had to talk a little bit about my experience. St. Simon's Island is one of the Gullah Geechee Islands. So please go back and watch that episode. I think you'll like it. The second caller talked about, I'm sorry, I don't mean to laugh. It's not actually funny about Native Americans not being enslaved. They were enslaved before Africans were enslaved. Christopher Columbus, one of the first things that he did when he arrived in the Caribbean, he never made it to the North American continent, but one of the first things he did was enslave Native Americans and make them mine gold, because people had gold. So he put them to work to mine gold. And then they proceeded to commit genocide, mass genocide. You talking about why they didn't enslave the Native Americans? They didn't survive the slavery. They decided to exterminate the people in order to occupy their land. This is the truth about American history. And this is what we were taught in school growing up as kids. Little children were told this is what they did. They exterminated the people. So, you know, you're talking about completely wiping out, you know, a continent full of human beings, and the remaining remnants of which are so few and far between. That, you know, they're given reservations, they're giving all kinds of concessions. Now they're trying to give them reparations, but there's not many of them left. And the fact that the Africans that they imported outnumber the indigenous people of this country should give us all cause to pause and reflect. I don't think the experience of indigenous American people is anything that we should envy or somehow say that they were respected more than we were, or that they were stronger than we were. These people were completely annihilated through germ warfare. They're some of the greatest victims historically of genocide in human history. With everything they did to us on the African continent, the fact that we still exist in the numbers that we do is testament to our resilience. The fact that we were ripped out and ported like goods, and yet you go to Africa and you see human beings everywhere is a miracle. The fact that we haven't been occupied by people that are not from Africa to the extent that they are the majority and we are not, should give you cause to pause and reflect. The experience of indigenous Americans is nothing to envy. And then the other questions about whether or not we wrote our own story. Absolutely. One of the beautiful things about Liberian history is that much of it, especially after the Republic and just before the Republic was established, is written by African people who were literate. Not only history, but fictional literature as well. The very first novel written by an African person in the English language, because we wrote fiction in Arabic and in other scripts, but in the English language, was written by a Vi man. And so we have to realize that a lot of the people who established Liberia and set up the government and set up the Republic were literate, and they wrote much detail. Edward Wilmot Blyden did a great job of not only writing history, but collecting manuscripts in Arabic from indigenous Liberian people and taking those manuscripts and translating them into English. letters, manuscripts, and other documents. He did an excellent job of cultural anthropology. You have Benjamin J.K. Anderson, who went and studied and traveled. He was the first person not born in Africa, born outside of Africa, to travel all the way into the Guinea Forest region and beyond to what is now called, what at the time was called Musadu before it fell to the French and the Fulani. But, so to the assumption that people have that African people, people of African descent didn't write their own history, I think it's just because they're not aware. It is not because it didn't happen. Most of the primary source documents I study are written by African people. The reason I'm focused on these demons today, these demons of history today, is because the title is Pick Sense Out of Nonsense. We're now talking about outsiders writing stories. But when we get past 1822, we start getting into, Liberia. Now we start to have things written by us in English, which is what I read, and the Arabic manuscripts that were translated by African Americans into English, which I can read. So now we can start talking about, great authors like William H. Hurd, who wrote a book called The Bright Side of Africa, which in fact, I have a copy here, but not sitting in front of me. But anyway, William Hurd wrote this book called The Bright Side of Africa. He described everything around him in great meticulous detail. That's a wonderful book. He talks about many of our ancestors, people who are watching today. You read that book, you might find your great-great-grandfather, his photograph and his life sketch in there. So there's a lot of books. I would advise anyone that wants to know about Liberian history, look up William Hurd, look up Edward Woolman Blyden, Benjamin J.K. Anderson. Benjamin J.K. Anderson, because of him, we know the names of so many native kings and towns that existed in the mid to late 1800s that do not exist anymore and have not been passed on through the oral tradition, but he wrote these things down. We know about King Momoru of Balpuru because Benjamin Anderson wrote his name down. So I want you all to think about that. This is this brilliant and courageous human being that went into the interior and documented everything he saw. This was an African American who came to Liberia as a child, was educated in Liberia, and was once part of the armed forces and became an explorer, and wrote about it and kept a meticulous journal as he explored Liberia. I can't hear you, sorry, Dennis.
Thank you. Houston Brooks said, great response to my question about contrasting the experience of the Native Americans to our African ancestors. And Black American Antebellum said, I read this book, meaning the book that you found offensive, and he said, but I was not offended. I was more offended by the Africans who sold people to him and helped him load kids into boats. That was disturbing.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I believe, and then another one more comments I wanted to read before we close here. Okay. Oh, Abbas also mentioned that he was going back and forth with another viewer about Arabs and slavery and Muslims.
Oh yes, sorry, I didn't know that. Yeah, I know we shouldn't measure oppression, right? But when I said earlier about not envying the experience of Native Americans and comparing and contrasting that, I said that because we haven't experienced that devastation, that level of genocide. But our story is long. You're talking about the Arab slave trade started at the end of the 8th century. And many of our people in the forest region went to the forest region to escape, the Arab slave trade and escape the imposition of Islam and all of those things upon our people. So at first we resisted. And then as people became to convert to this new religion, they joined their religious kin and started to participate in this economic venture of taking human beings across the Sahara. Many of the men were castrated. That was the practice of the Arabs. If you take a male slave, you castrate him. Part of the reason is Arabs had the cultural tradition of polygamy. And so because there's usually an equal, in fact, if you just look it up, world stats on male and female, the same number of men and women are born. So for polygamy to work, you're going to have men that don't have wives, or you start having men borrowing from the generation that comes after them to take on wives. And so they're taking these Africans in as slaves, they castrate them so that they cannot have women, they cannot have sex, so that, castrate them. If you don't have a wife, you will sleep with somebody else's wife. So they castrate men that were enslaved, and then they took the women into harems. And so many of these people have female African ancestors. If they trace their mitochondrial DNA, it will take them somewhere like Guinea, take them somewhere like Ghana, take them somewhere like Kenya. And it's because of this whole, taking women and castrating men. It was horrible. It lasted for much longer than the transatlantic slave trade. The devastation, though, affected the empires. And the two were also occurring simultaneously, is what a lot of people don't even realize. That while human beings were being pressured towards the coast, they were simultaneously being sold also across the Sahara. In fact, the trans-Sahara slave trade never ended. You're still seeing a modern version of this occurring today, with human trafficking and wealthy Arabs still desiring African women to be sex slaves for them. This is a very ancient tradition. We should probably have a show about that, Dennis. This whole taking these girls from Nigeria, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Togo, wherever, and selling them, in fact, even still smuggling them across the Sahara, and then across boats into, Arabia, beyond North Africa. So we have to understand that the world is organized today because of history. We're a product of history. We are a result of history, and we're a continuation of things that occurred historically. So I hope that answers your question. The transatlantic slave trade, the Arab slave trade, they were all horrible, and the human trafficking has not actually ended.
Thank you so much, Carl. We want to announce here about 15 gates incorporated in all Paul Cowell, Monserrato County. They are 100% all ladies and men's fashion design. So call the number on the screen and shop the best in men and women clothes and footwear. The number 0775-165-416 or 0880-026-2118. So call and shop and tell them you saw the ads on Focus on Liberia. Carl, thank you very much for making a lot of sense out of nonsense. I think you did that very well.
Thank you.
Let's get your parting comments in the next 49 seconds so that we can close. Thank you again for coming. I want to thank our viewers for always being here to watch Focus on Liberia. This is by far the most diverse program ever coming out of Liberia. I told somebody, I said, if you have a 2-bedroom house on top of the hill and a 14-bedroom house downhill, which one is bigger? The 2-bedroom house up there is not bigger because you can see it, but a 14-bedroom. So by far, Focus on Liberia is the biggest platform when it comes to internet television, because how many programs we have? Over 15. We are not just the one. Right. So that's the 14-bedroom house that is downhill. So if you see something that is most watched, it still doesn't make them the biggest, because plenty of people looking at it. Some of these people are even buying views. I don't want to even go there. Come here, Focus on Liberia, where we educate, we elevate, and promote all things Liberia. Carl, your closing comment.
So my closing comments is to, I think, address this idea of the noble savage, the simple, innocent, childlike African that's not capable of doing anything wrong, that's a perpetual victim. That disabuse your mind of that. We're fully human beings, and we're capable of committing atrocities, and we're capable of also being victims. The idea that we were incapable of participating, in the horrors of human history dehumanizes us. That narrative itself dehumanizes us. Human beings are complicated. We are capable of good, we're capable of wrong, Is the evil of the transatlantic slave trade something that we brought to the world? No, it's something that was brought upon us, and that many people who were victims also became perpetrators. Just to study some of the worst, the kingdom of Dahomey and many others, the Ashanti kingdom. And to this day, there are still people being enslaved in Ghana, and because it has become a cultural thing. They're still burying enslaved people with the Ashanti king when he dies in the 21st century. So I want people to know that human history is complicated, and human beings are complicated, and human beings have the capacity of good to do good, and they have the capacity to do evil. To absolve African people of the fullness of being human dehumanizes us. So stop with this narrative that we were just sitting around crying and being beaten because we're simple, mindless subhumans. That is not who we are. We are capable of wrong, we're capable of right. We have all of the complicated scope of human activity that every other group of people has had throughout history. We have villains, we have heroes, we have monsters, we have monster fighting militants. That is who we are. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carl. I want to also thank Huston Brooks. Keep this informative show on air. I'm making a donation right now via Cash App to $FOL TV. We need to learn more from Madame Fambule and the likes of her on FOL always. Thanks, Mr. Jab. Thank you also to Mr. Brooks. We want to thank all of you for watching tonight. In fact, Dr. Pajivo said he's fulfilled tonight. Thank you always for watching. Thanks, even for those who are not watching live, please check our YouTube channel, Facebook, and our Twitter page for this episode. Until then, we're going to end with our song that says, "We are all Liberians." Whether you are they, you are Grau, or you are Grau or Glebo, we say we are all Liberians, and let us do whatever it takes to make our country, Liberia, the glorious land of liberty. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
God bless you.
We are Liberia. Liberia is our home. Liberia people.